60 days after installing Linux on his laptop, my uncle called me on a Tuesday night and asked me one question. He is 61 years old. He has used Windows every single day since 1995. He's the kind of man who prints his emails, keeps a physical notebook next to his keyboard, and once called me in a panic because his desktop icons had rearranged themselves after an update. He is not a tech enthusiast. He is not someone who follows operating system news or cares about software architecture. He is exactly the KN of person the technology industry has always treated as a captive audience, someone who uses whatever comes pre-installed on the machine they bought and never seriously considers that anything else exists. And after 60 days of using Linux, completely alone, without me hovering over his shoulder or walking him through problems, he asked me why nobody had told him about this 10 years ago. That question has been sitting with me ever since, because the honest answer is deeply uncomfortable. Nobody told him, because for decades the consumer technology industry had a financial incentive to make sure people like him never even considered the alternative. When one company controls the operating system on the vast majority of personal computers on Earth, and when that control translates directly into hardware sales cycles, software subscription revenues, and advertising income, telling users that a free and capable alternative exists is precisely the last thing that company has any reason to do. My uncle spent 30 years inside a system that was designed at a structural level to make sure he never looked outside it. And what finally pushed him out was not a sudden interest in open source software. It was a corporation deciding that his perfectly functional laptop was no longer worth keeping. The number that sits at the center of this story, and that every Windows user should understand clearly, is 240 million. According to research from the analyst firm Canalys, approximately 240 million personal computers worldwide cannot be upgraded to Windows 11. Not because they are broken, not because they are slow, not because they have failed in any functional sense. They cannot be upgraded because Microsoft drew a line in the sand using hardware requirements that a significant portion of the existing Windows install base simply could not meet. The specific requirements were a TPM 2.0 security chip, certain processor generations, and specific firmware standards. Processors older than roughly 8th generation Intel Core or AMD Ryzen 2000 series were in many cases locked out entirely. Machines older than approximately 2018 fell on the wrong side of that line, and roughly 1 in 5 of every Windows computer on Earth ended up there. Canalys put the physical scale of this in terms that are difficult to forget. If those 240 million machines were folded laptops stacked on top of each other, the pile would stretch 600 kilometers past the moon. The electronic waste from those computers could weigh an estimated 480 million kilograms, the equivalent of 320,000 cars sent to a landfill. Not because the machines stopped working, because one company decided they were no longer eligible. Microsoft ended mainstream support for Windows 10 on October 14, 2025. From that date forward, there were no more free security updates, no more feature patches, no more routine technical support for the operating system that had been running on the majority of those 240 million machines. For users who wanted to keep their machines protected, Microsoft offered 3 choices. Upgrade to Windows 11 if you're hardware qualified. Pay $30 for a single year of extended security updates, an offer that expired in October 2026 with no renewal option available to consumers. Or buy a brand new computer. For millions of people, including my uncle, none of those options felt remotely acceptable. His laptop was 5 years old. It ran perfectly. It did everything he needed it to do. Microsoft had declared it obsolete, and the $30 extended support offer that might have seemed like a reasonable lifeline came with strings that most people never read. One of the enrollment options required users to sync their PC settings through a Microsoft account, which in practical terms meant trading personal data and telemetry for the right to remain protected on a machine they already owned and had already paid for. To understand why my uncle reached the point of calling me and saying he was done, you need to understand what Windows 11 had been doing to his experience in the months leading up to that conversation. The Start menu, which is the front door of the operating system and the first thing a user interacts with every time they sit down at their computer, had begun filling with advertisements. The Recommended section, which once showed recent files and frequently used applications, started promoting third-party apps from the Microsoft Store. New installations pinned shortcuts for services like TikTok and Spotify without the user's permission. Users reported accidentally clicking on promotions when trying to reach their own files. Enterprise IT administrators were fielding support calls from employees who had inadvertently signed up for services through promotional pop-ups on corporate devices. To longtime Windows users, it felt as though the operating system they had paid for was being turned into a billboard for products they had never asked to see. Then came Recall, which was announced in May of 2024, and which caused the most significant trust crisis Microsoft had faced from its own user base in many years. Recall was designed as an AI-powered photographic memory for the computer, taking screenshots of everything visible on screen every few seconds and storing them in a searchable local database so users could look back through their own activity using natural language. Security researchers raised alarm almost immediately. The feature captured private messages, banking details, medical records, passwords, and everything else visible on screen, storing it all in a local database that was initially unencrypted. Microsoft had originally planned to enable Recall by default. After fierce and sustained backlash, the company delayed the feature multiple times, eventually made it opt-in, and added encryption protections. But the damage to trust was already done, and it arrived precisely at the moment when Microsoft was also showing my uncle full-screen pop-ups on his Windows 10 desktop, urging him to buy a Copilot Plus PC. Not a subtle notification in a corner, a full-screen interruption embedded in the operating system itself, blurring the boundary between a security warning and a hardware sales pitch. That was the moment he called me and said he was done. And I told him about Zorin OS. Zorin OS launched in October of 2025, with timing that was entirely deliberate. Within 5 weeks, it had crossed 1 million downloads. The development team behind it reported that over 78% of those downloads came from Windows machines. By January of 2026, the number had reached 2 million downloads in under 3 months. No Linux distribution designed for desktop consumers had ever grown at that speed. Linux Mint, Ubuntu, and during the same period, but Zorin became the symbol of the migration, because it was built for exactly one purpose: to make Windows users feel at home from the first moment they saw the desktop. It looks like Windows, it behaves like Windows, it runs on precisely the kind of older hardware that Microsoft had declared unworthy of Windows 11, and it was built by two brothers in Dublin, Ireland, who started writing code as teenagers. Artyom and Cairo Zorn started Zorin OS in 2008. They were 12 and 14 years old. Their parents were Ukrainian immigrants. Their father was a translator, and their mother was an artist. There were no programmers in the family. The brothers taught themselves to code from books and YouTube tutorials. The entire project began because their father tried Linux, found it too confusing, and told his sons that someone needed to make it feel more like Windows. That complaint became a company. That company's operating system is now the fastest growing desktop Linux distribution in the world. More than 780,000 of its downloads in the first wave came directly from Windows machines, each one representing a person who went looking for an answer that Microsoft was not willing to give them, and found it in software built by two self-taught teenagers who started with a frustrated parent and a simple idea. My uncle's laptop, a perfectly functional machine with an older Intel processor and no TPM 2.0 chip, went from a device Microsoft wanted to send to a landfill to a machine that boots faster, runs quieter, and receives free security updates for years to come. Installing Zorin OS on a Saturday afternoon took approximately 40 minutes from start to finish. When the desktop appeared, he looked at it and said it looked like Windows. I showed him the web browser, the file manager, and how to open his email. Within 10 minutes, he was navigating on his own. Within a week, he had stopped calling me with questions. Within a month, he told me his laptop felt faster than it had in years. And then came that Tuesday night phone call at the 60-day mark with a question I was genuinely not prepared for. Why didn't anyone tell me about this 10 years ago? The answer to that question is not really about Linux. It is about the entire structure of the consumer technology industry and the incentives that have shaped it for decades. An industry that profits when people replace things that still work has very little reason to tell those people that free, high-quality alternatives exist. My uncle is one person, but he represents millions. He uses his computer for email, for reading the news, for video calls with his grandchildren, and for managing a small spreadsheet where he tracks his monthly expenses. He is exactly the kind of person Windows was built for 30 years ago, and exactly the kind of person that the current direction of Windows has been, systematically failing. When the full-screen upgrade prompts started appearing on his Windows 10 desktop in late 2024, he did not understand what they meant. He thought his computer was broken. When I explained that Microsoft was telling him to buy a new computer, he was confused. When I told him his machine could not run Windows 11 because it lacked a specific security chip, he asked me what a TPM was. After I explained it as best I could, he said something that cut straight through all the technical language. So my computer is fine, but they will not let me use it anymore. He understood the situation completely. He just could not accept the logic of it, and he was right not to. The broader migration this represents is measurable and accelerating. StatCounter recorded Linux at just under 3% of the global desktop market as of early 2026. The United States crossed 5% Linux desktop share for the first time in June of 2025. Steam, the largest PC gaming platform in the world, recorded Linux at 5.33% of its active users in March of 2026, the highest gaming share ever measured on the platform. These are not projections or estimates. They are measured numbers, and they are moving in one direction. The environmental dimension of this story adds another layer of significance. Canalys had warned as early as 2023 that Windows 10's end of support would trigger the largest wave of PC-related electronic waste in history. By late 2025, environmental groups and technology advocates were pointing to lightweight Linux distributions as the most practical way to extend the useful life of these machines by years, reducing both waste and the financial burden on consumers who could not afford new hardware. Schools in developing countries, community centers, families on fixed incomes, the people who could least afford to replace a working computer, were the ones being asked to do exactly that. A free operating system running on older hardware is not just a convenience for people like my uncle. For many people around the world, it is the difference between having a functional computer and not having one at all. In March of 2026, reports emerged that Microsoft was beginning to scale back some of the most aggressive promotional elements inside Windows 11. The company appeared to acknowledge, at least partially, that embedding advertising into the Start menu, the notification system, the lock screen, and File Explorer had crossed a line that its own users were not willing to accept. How To Geek, one of the most widely read technology publications, ran a piece around the same time with a headline that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier, stating simply that Microsoft had lost the plot and listing 5 Windows features that nobody had asked for, with recall at the top and Start menu ads immediately behind it. The article resonated because it said out loud what millions of users had been feeling privately, and because it was not coming from Linux enthusiasts or open source advocates. It was coming from ordinary people who simply wanted their computer to work the way it used to. Linux is not a perfect solution, and it would be dishonest to present it as one. If you depend on specific professional software, certain versions of Adobe Creative Suite, specialized accounting programs, or some enterprise applications, there may not be a native Linux version available, and compatibility layers have improved enormously, but are not seamless for everything. If you are a heavy gamer, the situation is dramatically better than it was 5 years ago, thanks to Valve's Proton compatibility layer in the Steam Deck. But there are still titles that require extra configuration or that do not work at all. There will be moments where unfamiliar dialog boxes appear and solutions require searching online rather than following intuition. These are real limitations, and anyone who presents Linux as a magic solution for every person in every situation is not being straight with you. But my uncle does not know any of that because none of it applies to him. He knows that his laptop works again. He knows it is fast and quiet. He knows that nobody is trying to sell him anything when he opens his Start menu. And he knows that for the first time in 30 years of owning a computer, he does not feel like the product. That last part is the thing that stayed with him most, and the thing that his question really pointed toward. Why? Didn't anyone tell me about this 10 years ago? Because the industry that was supposed to serve him had a 30-year financial incentive to make sure he never asked.